Good morning, everyone. It is Friday, May 29th. This is David Quam at Denton's in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to have you with us. This is our 12th webinar in a series, updates on the coronavirus and issues, both legal issues and corporate issues and policy issues related to the response to COVID-19. Today, we are pleased to have a very distinguished panel with us, Denton's attorneys from all around the globe, talking about corporate board challenges during COVID-19. Corporate boards are continuing to address the business challenges due to COVID-19. They have a critical role to play in transitioning companies to a new strategic plan of operations and overseeing management's decisions impacting all stakeholders, including employees, workplace safety, changing customer demands and markets, and shareholders. Our panel today is going to discuss what issues are top of mind for boards moving from crisis to reopening and eventually to recovery. But before we turn to our distinguished panel, I get to introduce them. I want to talk a little bit about some of the policy developments both in Washington, D.C. and the states. Let's advance the slide one, please. As I said, this is our 12th webinar here at Denton's. If you go to dentons.com, you can go to our COVID-19 hub. We have information regarding not only this webinar, which will be recorded and available to you after this, but we have more than 120 client alerts covering all sorts of legal issues, from corporate issues, force majeure, environmental issues, and the most pressing policy concerns. Denton's is the world's largest law firm. We have more than 12,000 attorneys in 185 offices across 73 countries around the globe. Our partners have been serving clients in some of the hot spots, trying to react to COVID-19. We've used all that experience to try to both serve our clients, protect our people, and assist our communities in which we work and live. This webinar is part of that effort to keep clients up to date and provide the most useful information we can so that you can make the best decisions for your employees, your people, and your communities. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the policy ramifications and activities happening in Washington, D.C. Let's go ahead and advance the slide one, please. One more. Across the United States, even as states are starting to reopen, it's a good reminder that all states are suffering from COVID-19. Cases across the board, and in most states, although starting to decline in numbers of new cases, cases are still being brought in every single jurisdiction across the United States. Right now, let's move to the next slide. The biggest issue facing states is when and how to reopen. As you'll see from this map, and as you've, I'm sure, been paying attention coming out of the Memorial Day weekend, every state has been looking at how they can reopen. Can they do it safely? Can they allow businesses to get restarted? How do we maintain social distance? How do we maintain the benefits that we've had from a health standpoint with regard to keeping people safe while starting to restart the economy? This is an issue in all 50 states. All 50 states are taking different tacks as how and when they will reopen. Much of that is based both on their caseload, but also on their economies. This issue is one that will be with us for the coming weeks. There's a lot of focus both from the governor level and the state level and the county level on what will happen coming out of Memorial Day weekend, especially for some of those jurisdictions who have been large tourist locations and had very large gatherings either at a beach or at recreational facilities, which had not been previously opened in the last 10 weeks. Next slide, please. Here at Denton's, part of what we do is we track all 50 states, the largest cities and the largest counties, for the most updated information as to what is happening coming out of the governor's offices, mayor's offices, and county councils. To really respond to COVID-19, you have to look not only at what's happening at the federal level, but really watch what's happening at the state level, city level, and county level. Only then do you have a complete picture. Our 50-state tracker is available to everybody for free. The link is here on the website on our COVID-19 hub. It's one of our most popular sites as people really look to get the most relevant and recent information of what's happening locally. Next slide, please. At the federal level, everybody's watching to see how is Congress going to react. Congress has been in a state of first responding, then stabilizing, and now eventually they're going to move to trying to stimulate the economy. That being said, it appears that through the month of June, the US Senate is going to be responding to actions that the House took just last week in passing the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act is still very much a bill about stabilizing the economy. A huge focus of that bill was on providing relief to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments who have to balance their budgets. And because of the 10-week stay-at-home order and really the shutdown of the economy, the budget holes in many of those state and local governments are going to cause massive budget problems in the months ahead. For state and local governments, any money they lose, they have to make up either by cutting expenditures or by raising taxes or raising revenues. By trying to backfill some of those decisions, it will help state and local governments not make any sort of recession or downturn worse. That's going to be a major part of this bill. You'll see from many of the other provisions here, we're also looking at sick leave, improving the Paycheck Protection Program, focusing on testing. We're still very much in the stabilization and response phase at the federal level. Now, that being said, there are a couple of things you need to pay attention to from a calendar standpoint of what is to come. One, several infrastructure reauthorization bills are still pending and have to be completed, including a highway reauthorization. So infrastructure is still very likely on the table. Infrastructure is also a key way that the government can help stimulate the economy. Number two is the regular appropriations bills. Congress has put on hold all of its regular appropriations as it responds to the pandemic. Those bills will have to be completed before the end of the federal fiscal year, which comes on October 1st. Lastly, who can forget, we have elections. And the election politics is going to play a larger and larger role as we move forward, both into the response from Congress, but also the oversight of these programs and starting to track all the money that's gone into the economy. So even as we try to stimulate the economy and put people back to work, there's still going to be an awful lot of oversight as to how the money was spent and making sure it was spent properly. Here at Denton's, we're tracking very carefully what is happening at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level to try to give you the best picture and allow you to respond from a business standpoint to everything that's happening in the marketplace. Next slide, please. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Today, we have Helen Reeves, a partner in our capital markets and venture technology group in New York. Stephen Shergold, a partner in our London office, who focuses on environmental, social, and corporate governance. Gordon Giffen, a partner in our public policy and regulatory group in Atlanta and Washington, D.C. He currently is on the corporate boards of the Canadian National Railway, Canadian Natural Resources, and CIBC Bank, US. And then Gail Leone, our senior counsel and member of Next Law In-House Solutions. He's also the former general counsel of Harley-Davidson and currently serving on the corporate boards of Badger Meter, Inc. and Sargento Foods. With that, Gail, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation about issues that are really top of mind for boards in this very, very challenging environment. We know that companies can't return to normal. We know they need to focus on rebuilding operations safely, even if the company has remained operating as an essential business. We know they need to focus on recovering revenue and rethinking opportunities and risks. So what is their roadmap to reopen? What's their roadmap at this time? And what should boards be addressing in their virtual boardrooms at this time? One of the most important skills that I've found is necessary for board members is the ability to ask tough questions and think strategically about these issues. So we're going to talk a little bit today with our very terrific panel about human capital management, about financial condition and strategic planning, and also risk assessment, which would be issues that we think are really sort of the first things that boards should be focused on. The thing that's different about this crisis is the fact, and if you just compare it with that of 2008, for example, and other previous financial meltdowns, is the fact that employee lives are really at stake. And it's not just their jobs. And if you're in a customer-facing business, you have customer lives that may be affected as well. So how are boards fulfilling their fiduciary duties and providing oversight to management's decisions related to health and safety, getting their business back to a safe operating environment? Stephen, based on your experience with your clients, how can boards provide strategic guidance regarding human capital management this time and focus on creating a more inclusive environment in this space?
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, and I think that the point that you picked up on there is something that we've seen in Europe coming to the fore very early in the response to this crisis, which is that the particular human nature of it, and therefore the focus very early on health, safety, and welfare. And so from a board's perspective, what we've seen is that really playing out in two levels. So firstly, and I'm sure it's something we'll unpack as we go through the discussion this morning, is in relation to the liability of the company, in relation to the expenditure that is required, is proportionate and is reasonable in the circumstances, especially in a changing environment where scientific and medical knowledge is evolving constantly. You know, that's very challenging for a board and for management, because the other nature, of course, of this crisis is that it's happening all over the world at the same time. And so scientific knowledge is developing in different places at different speeds. And that dynamic, especially for businesses that are operating in more than one jurisdiction, is something that the board needs to have oversight of and ensure that the operating business is taking on board in their decisions. But the second aspect, which I wanted to just touch on really in answer to your first question, is for those companies that really see the stakeholder of the employee as core to their values. You know, we've seen very much in the lead-in to COVID the development of ESG, environmental, social, and governance credentials, and looking at that broader purpose of businesses. And so for those boards that are driving those values through the business, the oversight, I think, has already been much highlighted on the stakeholder of the employee. So, you know, I take, for example, investors such as KKR that we've worked with and who have used their board positions to ensure that as their portfolio companies get ready for restarting, that in fact the protection of the workforce was the first thing that was addressed. And in fact, a long time before governments were talking about it, because that aspect of the social values of the business is right at the heart of the company. And so the reputation going forward and the value in the company is really tied up with their response to COVID.
There is a lot of discussion now that this may actually accelerate the focus on the S in ESG, which I think is really interesting from that perspective. Helen, since you counsel more US-based companies, what are you seeing with your clients related to human capital management, reputational risks that the boards are weighing as well?
Sure. So I think on my side of the house, you know, I'm working with venture-backed and private equity-owned companies. There's a really strong emphasis on retention of talent. You know, in these times, you do see a lot of earlier stage companies or growth stage companies furloughing their employees, you know, rethinking compensation, rethinking bonus packages, et cetera, just to manage costs as, you know, revenues decline in light of COVID. But there's also a keen focus on retaining talent in this time, just, given that there's a lot of opportunity out there potentially to move. I know we'll talk a little bit about that potentially later, but retention of talent is key. I think also from a reputational perspective, and to the extent that costs are being managed and salaries or even jobs are being cut, there's certainly a focus on making sure that those cuts are seen as being done across the board. So at the most senior levels, all the way down to, rank and file. So CEOs taking, cuts to their salary, CFOs taking cuts to their salary, and not being perceived as, something that's being borne just by the rank and file employees from a reputational perspective is really important. And then I would also say, for VCs on the VC and the PE side, certainly there's been just sort of like a retrenchment and looking at their portfolio and thinking about how they can support and help, businesses that are in their portfolio, whether it's through actual cash infusion or just providing resources and guidance, to manage through supply chain issues and the like. So even from the sort of money side of the house, from the fund side of the house, there is a focus on building that reputation as being supportive of their portfolio in this really difficult time.
Yeah, we've also seen some reputational influence or issues related to taking advantage of certain government programs as it related even to supporting employees. And that,
definitely.
that has been a factor. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I think you might even be alluding to the SBA payroll protection program, which, was rolled out very quickly, and the regulations around the program were evolving live. So and we were very deep in that exercise of sort of understanding what the regs meant on a day-to-day basis, really minute to minute, they were changing in terms of guidance. And so we had clients at all stages, a small business, really, looking to us to give them guidance on what those regs meant and whether they could apply. And then, of course, folks received funds, and now there's been this sort of, I'll call it backlash, quite frankly, of reviewing who received government money and whether they should have taken it. And there's certainly been some concern around, reputational risk associated with being perceived as taking advantage of funds that maybe could have been allocated to a business that was in worse shape. So certainly boards, even before, taking the funds, we're having very deep discussions about the financial position of the business, whether or not it was so dire that they felt, government money was really the only way to go. And then once they took that money, sort of understanding whether or not they should be returning those funds in light of certain reputational issues that have come up. And if not, how do they preserve the forgiveness aspect of those funds by using them for the purposes stated? So it's been really an evolving area, particularly around government support, financial support of these businesses.
And I think that's exactly the kind of issue that boards should be addressing and focusing on, that balance from a strategic perspective in helping management make those decisions related to the actions that they're taking, because it has clearly long-term implications for those companies. We know this is not only a health crisis of immense proportion, but it's also really basically a restructuring of the global economic order that's put enormous financial pressure on companies. Gordon, how are you working with your clients, and what are you seeing on the boards in which you sit about conversations that are going on about business continuity, about capital redeployment or reallocation, funding needs of those companies? Obviously, Helen alluded to it. Those are obviously critical issues today, whether you're a small business or you're a large business. It's just critical. And I think also if you could talk to strategic opportunities that may come out of this as well.
Sure. Thanks, Gail. Absolutely. The new normal, we don't know what it will look like, but we know it's not going to look like the old normal. And it's my belief and observation that the companies that accept this challenging time as an opportunity and adjust and innovate will emerge into whatever the new normal is in a relatively stronger position, certainly relative to their competition. Most boards in both small and large cap companies are grappling today with the cost side of the equation, as well as cash flow, in a sense, in the nature of short-term survival. But those who are focused on, the boards that are focusing with management on reorienting their strategic plans going forward to address what the new normal may be, will likely emerge ahead of the pack. New markets and new ways of addressing old markets are the strategic opportunity. Now, you mentioned capital deployment. Capital allocation right now is an extraordinarily important challenge for managements and boards. Certainly, it seems like the share buyback is an anachronism at this point. And most companies are struggling with whether they can maintain current dividends and want to do so, if at all possible, to demonstrate that they will emerge in a strong fashion. Oftentimes, companies and boards are trying to figure out if they can defer long-term capital projects that may or may not be addressing the new market dynamic, but certainly have to allocate capital in the short run to maintain the business as it is today. And those with to your last point, those with a relatively strong balance sheet, and that is a relative statement because most balance sheets are less strong than they were before, can be very opportunistic in this environment in order to acquire other businesses in their line of business or to expand their scope in order to add market share as they emerge. And I'm seeing that a lot in the resource sector, largely in the oil and gas sector. When you look at what global oil prices have been doing, there are real opportunities for some of the smaller cap companies to be acquired by some of the larger ones in the right geography. And the last thing on that I'll say is it hasn't really emerged yet, I think, too much in the public dialogue, but it appears that going forward, natural gas prices may rise in a stronger way than oil prices. So natural gas producers may very well have a better financial situation in the resource sector than many people currently anticipate. So reorienting your strategic plan and trying to reorient your capital allocation in order to address that new strategic plan, I think, is a very major priority for boards.
I have one question for you, because you talked about the resources, natural resources. Do you think that there will be, and there's been some dialogue around this, the CEO of Goldman just came out with that we will emerge from this greener, that will emerge from this more sustainable? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think there's no question that we will remain on a path to be a more sustainable energy economy globally, certainly in North America, Europe as well. I'm not sure it's going to accelerate that path, though. I don't think we're going to emerge in a way where people are less dependent on some fossil fuels in the short run. But there's no question that part of the reorientation of capital allocation right now is to see how companies, even resource producers, the Canadian oil sands, for example, are trying to figure out how to produce the product in a less environmentally intense way, because the consumption is the same wherever it's consumed. The question is, relative to other producing areas, is your business producing at a lower carbon footprint? And a lot of companies are now, as you suggest, examining how to do that with renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Helen, one of the issues that's come up with U.S. companies and has gotten into the boardroom are the issue about guidance. Since you work more with U.S. companies, can you talk a little bit about the challenges they've had, withdrawal of guidance, forward-looking plans, disclosure requirements, SEC pronouncement on that? That would be helpful.
Sure. So we've certainly seen, most companies withdrawing their guidance. There was some relief that was issued by the SEC in the past couple of months, sort of in anticipation of these issues. Of course, you put out guidance in maybe January or the top of the year, and then COVID hits in March and everything's upended. There's technically no duty to update, but a lot of, companies were thinking about whether they should be updating their guidance. And then the SEC gave, conditional relief that, there could be updates or withdrawals of guidance in light of COVID. So many companies have taken that approach. I think on the private company side, one thing that I've seen that's been pretty interesting is just sort of the heightened focus of boards on having sort of off-cycle meetings and discussions live about where the company sits in their forecasting. So whether that's, typically we would only have, board meetings every quarter. Now we're having board calls every month to talk about where we are in sales, where we are with, our headcount and overhead costs. There's been a lot of discussion with CEOs that I've been having offline about ways to manage costs, and then upward communication to the board. So while there isn't the same sort of, forward-looking statement, public, disclosure issues for private companies, there still is this demand for increased communication and updating to different constituencies like boards of directors by management. So I'm seeing a lot of that. And then I also want to touch on something that Gordon brought up around M&A, because I had a really great conversation with a representative from Providence Equity Partners who sits on several boards of VC-backed and private equity-backed companies. And his view on M&A in particular was that if you're on a board considering M&A, you want to be really thoughtful about time horizons right now, because a lot of folks that were looking to deploy capital and make acquisitions are, of course, pulling their capital back, rethinking the strategy. If you're looking to sell your business, you may also want to think about ways in which you can use COVID to enhance or change or in some way, alter the value of your business, whether it's strategy, et cetera, so that you can emerge at the end of this, whatever that is, a more attractive target. I wanted to just bring that up because Gordon had brought up M&A opportunities from, the sort of large and small. And I think we've seen that slow down, but I think there is an opportunity to use this time to rethink the business and the strategy.
Great. One of the more critical issues that boards have to focus on is risk assessment. Obviously there were risk assessment or ERM plans that have been put in place. Those obviously need updating. Management is probably updating inventory and assessment of risks, including increased government mandates, workforce disruptions, sustainability of upstream supply chains and then downstream customers, and also the reputational threats. I know, Stephen, in your practice, you focus a lot on the ESG aspect of governance. And so I'd love your thoughts about how boards can effectively manage these risks now. What should they be asking management for relative to all the changes that are going on? And is this really the right time to be focused on that?
Well, Gail, one of the real challenges right now is, especially for businesses that are operating in more than one jurisdiction, is that they will be hearing different regulatory requirements that face a workforce that is, the same workforce for the same company, but just happens to be operating in different jurisdictions, and is now, and those businesses are looking at different standards and working out how to harmonize that approach, how to make that approach efficient. And so it's extremely important for boards right now to be asking their management teams to ensure that they have that oversight of that evolving and very uneven playing field across those different jurisdictions where they're operating. It struck me at the beginning of today's webinar when we saw David's map of the US, and just in the US, you guys are dealing with all those different approaches of the states. Now, many of our clients are going to be operating not just in multiple states, but in multiple countries. And in Europe right now, as we see the response in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, which is very, very different, in Spain and Italy, if you're operating in these jurisdictions, you have got a different underlying legal regime. You've got regulators that are approaching it from different perspectives. And you have got different, as I mentioned before, development of scientific and technical knowledge. And to understand that landscape right now is so crucial from an ESG perspective, because as I mentioned, you know, your workers are going to expect to be treated in the same way with the same value system wherever they're operating globally. So that kind of coordination, I think, is essential for boards right now.
Yeah. I think that good boards understand the line between management and what their obligations are in running the companies and the board's fiduciary duty of strategic direction and oversight. But I know that a lot of boards are concerned about whether they're doing enough, whether they're monitoring enough the health and safety and compliance operations. So what do you see boards, and this really is a question for all of you, how do you see boards documenting this? How do you see that they're actually demonstrating that they are doing this, so that if there are issues down the road, they at least have fulfilled their fiduciary duty? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll jump in. This is Gordon. The thing I'm in the initial phases, let's say over the first 6 weeks of this challenge and into the shutdown around the world, boards, I think, were asking for weekly updates from management on how the health side of the business was being handled and how the employees in particular were being handled, as well as the business strategic aspect of it. As we've come along into the next 6 weeks of this, at least I see a lot of circumstances where management is now pushing back and saying, we have a job to do, and preparing to brief the board once a week, and then going through all sorts of random questions from the board as they inquire about things they're interested in is really a distraction from getting this done. And so I don't know that I'm directly addressing your question about how it's getting documented, but what I find now, you're at the right balance, and that word has been used a lot today, for the board to do its oversight, but not to get into it on too frequent a basis where they're more or less hearing the same things and distracting management, because boards, I think, have to stop and think. Management really does spend a lot of time preparing to address the board. And if they're spending a lot of time to address the board with the same things the board heard last week, that's not an effective use of management time.
It is an excellent point, and it really goes to that sort of division of responsibility. I'm getting weekly updates, but I just get them in an email format through our diligent board, and that works just fine, because you know what the issues are, and if you have questions, you can ask. But I agree with you, because having been management most recently and in those boardrooms having to prepare those things, it takes a lot of time, and it's probably unnecessary from that standpoint. But I think there is an element of documenting, making sure that there's a record of the fact that this information has gotten to the board, that the board has weighed in where appropriate, and that those priorities of the financial condition and the human capital management are front and center in their analysis, which I think is important. How they monitor it is really important. One thing that you raised earlier, Helen, and I know, Gordon, you're sensitive to this as well, given sort of how you navigate some of the government mandates, one of the big issues that companies are concerned about and boards are concerned about is immigration-related issues, movement, just even movement cross-border, whether it's US-Mexico, US-Canada, in Europe. I mean, we have Brexit as another complicating factor in Europe now. But this whole concept of being able to move not only your top executives, but other talent in the company. And you mentioned this earlier, Helen. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think what's happened, as a result of COVID is that a lot of exceptional talent that was expecting to be working at certain, in certain businesses has unfortunately been let go. And so you've got this new pool of folks that are looking for opportunities. So that's, created, movement, obviously. I think there's also a sense that there may be opportunistic behavior, poaching that may be going on as between competitors and businesses, where they see, well, hey, you know, we noticed that there were some salary cuts being done, or there was some, you know, freezes being done on compensation. You know, if you came over here, you know, you'd do a lot better. Sort of that kind of, those conversations going back and forth. And then I think that there's just a sense that, you know, at the board level and at the senior management level, there's got to be more to be done to retain talent, you know, in this sort of trying time. So how do we identify the high performers, make sure that they understand that, you know, whatever cuts or changes have been made to their compensation are, you know, hopefully temporary and will be, you know, sort of addressed, you know, in the future. How do we keep people motivated also in a time when, you know, they're being asked probably to do more, whether it's preparing board materials on a regular basis, you know, heightened focus on sales, but are ultimately being compensated a lot less. You know, how do we motivate them and make sure that they don't leave? I think those are all considerations that, you know, boards and senior management are facing right now.
Yes, Stephen or Gordon, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, Gail, I think the thing I would add is, with respect to government, we need to, our companies that we advise and where we sit on boards need to keep in mind, right now there's too much focus, I think, in companies on how can the government send me money or backstop my finances. That's important, but they need to also keep their eye on the Hippocratic oath, if you will, do no harm. They have to stay engaged with government to suggest that in the rush to try and appear to be addressing this pandemic, that they not do things that are actually harmful. And to your point, exacerbating immigration limitations, for example, in North America, that were already in place for ideological and political reasons, now to exacerbate that using COVID as the reason, may very well be doing harm. And I see that every day in the Canada-US context. If you go to Canada for a board meeting, for example, if you choose to travel, you are required to stay in isolation for 14 days after you're there. So nobody really means to stay in the Royal York Hotel in Toronto for 14 days to attend an 18-hour board meeting. So government is making things more difficult now, I think, than necessary in some of these situations. And it's the business community's responsibility to continue to counsel government on those issues.
Stephen, do you have any thoughts about that, sitting in Europe?
Yeah, I would just say that in Europe, you know, we really echo those kind of factors that both Helen and Gordon have explained. And I think that maybe just one area that is slightly accentuated is where you have countries that historically have been in quite a tight trading block, where you've got migration moving back and forward on a daily basis, who have taken very different approaches to the crisis, to the pandemic, and therefore we're starting to see very different results in terms of getting the new cases under control. And what I'm really thinking about there is the Nordic countries, where you've got Norway, who took very urgent and immediate action, and now very much has a very low rate of new cases, versus Sweden, who have, you know, perhaps are well known across the world as being the country that didn't go into lockdown and kept its sort of bars and restaurants open, who have a continuingly fairly high level of new cases. Now, when you try to unlock those flows of workers again between Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, you have Denmark and Norway who feel that, you know, they've got to one stage of the curve, and perhaps they haven't in Sweden. And so that adds a governmental level to this issue.
Sadly, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you all for your thoughts. You've been terrific and given good guidance, both to management and to boards. This topic is obviously evolving. It is changing really daily. We have continuing economic uncertainties, and hopefully some opportunities will come out of this pandemic. So I think you need to stay tuned. In the immortal words of Bob Dylan, the times, they are changing. And so I hope that we can continue this conversation because there'll be more issues next week and the week after. So thank you. David, back to you.
Gail, thank you very much. For everybody, I think this was an excellent panel, a lot of fantastic information. All of this will be available on Denton's website in our COVID hub this afternoon. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact any of our panelists. You contact them through our Denton's website. We are more than happy to help. From all of us at Denton's, please be safe. We hope you and your families are healthy. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.